here. Now, having looked at some of the answers I've got in for the Let Me In poster analysis task, I've noticed that people seem to be making the similar kinds of mistakes. So I thought I'd do a video feedback, because obviously we're not in class at the moment, and talk about the things you could have talked about. Okay? So, first things first, what was the question? Well, the question was, as it says, media language. Question 2 is based on an unseen film poster for Let Me In, released in 2010. Study the film poster carefully before answering the question. So the question was, explore how codes and conventions create meaning in this film poster for 15 marks. Right, first things first, most people's answers were very short. For 15 marks, you need to be writing at least a side to a side and a half of A4. Most people were writing only about half a side. That's not enough to really answer this question. Now, whilst it's a poster you won't have seen before, there is some stuff you should have picked up on, right? What you've got to be using is all your knowledge that you've gained from all the different parts of the course you've been doing so far and bringing it together in a holistic way. Now, one of the first issues with this is something I've been telling you repeatedly since the beginning of the year. You're still not doing enough in terms of detailed textual analysis. You need to be talking about, in detail, things like image composition, the cinematography, so the use of lighting, the use of composition, the use of colour, the lens types, the camera angles, the shot types. You need to be considering the mise-en-scène, props, costumes, locations, right? But in the case of print, you need to be considering the kinds of fonts that are used, why are those fonts being used, what does it say, why does it say that? We also need to be looking at generic conventions. So we need to first identify, well, what genre is this film poster, and how do the use of generic tropes and conventions tell us what genre it is? How is this poster communicating meaning to us? What's it trying to make us think? What is denoted? What is connoted? So what we need is lots of semiotic analysis. So two things you need to be mentioning straight off the bat are, one, Stephen Neal's genre theory, and two, Roland Barthes' semiotics theories. Right? We also need to be considering the relationship between text and image. So for a stretch and challenge thing, you could be mentioning Roland Barthes' theory of anchorage, for example. Right. We also need to be considering not just the generic conventions of horror, but what are the generic conventions of movie poster design, which is something we did right at the very beginning of the course. So what kind of theories could you have been talking about? Well, for a start, I've already mentioned some of the language theories. We mentioned Stephen Neal and we mentioned Roland Barthes. You could also have been talking about enigma theory, which ties in with Todorow's narratology theory. Even within a still image like this, the way in which semiotics is used implies a narrative. And within that, as part of an enigma. Now, an enigma is a quiz. It's a problem that needs solving. It's some mystery. Well, horror films are all about mystery, aren't they, in many ways? This poster, whilst a still image, throws up all sorts of enigmas that can only be answered if you watch the film, right? Within this image, we've also got binary opposites. You could have been mentioning Claude Levi-Strauss, right? And then finally, there are some elements of postmodernism we could mention. We'll get back to that later. Don't forget, of course, that a movie poster is a piece of advertising promotional material. It's there to promote the movie. It's there to draw the audience in and get them intrigued. So we can be considering some industry theory. Now, don't forget, even though they've lumped it in with, media language, genre theory is really about industries. Genre is a selling point. It's something you use to sell movies. Remember that audiences are getting increasingly conservative. They don't like risk. It costs a lot of money to go to the cinema or buy a DVD or to rent something off a streaming service, for example. In general, if you've got Netflix, for example, and you've got thousands of films to choose from, you need something about this film that's going to reach out and grab you. And the poster is part of that sales pitch. It draws audiences in. So remember, it comes into this. And then we've got Curran and Seaton. You remember Curran and Seaton's talking about the idea that, you know, the film industry, as much as any other media industry, is dominated by massive media conglomerates. And they don't like risk. Right? They like to play things safe, and that restricts sort of like diversity and choice. Hesmergelch, again, is talking about the fact that media industries minimise risks and maximise audiences through stars, franchises, through the use of serials, as he calls it, rather than franchises, through genre, through remakes, reboots, and all those other kind of postmodern elements. It's part of postmodernism, right? Remakes, reboots, sequels, franchises, all part of postmodernism, ties in with Hesmergelch's cultural industries theory. And I don't know if you knew this or not, but Let Me In is a remake, right? So it's postmodern in that respect. We could also be looking here a little bit at representation as well. Who is being represented, what is being represented, how are they being represented, and what is it about the semiotics that tells us this? Obviously, we've got a male and a female character. They are both children. How does that relate to the horror genre? What is it saying about femininity, masculinity? Is it reinforcing or subverting stereotypical gender roles? So these are some of the things you could have been talking about. So, first things first, as I said, you're not talking enough about the kinds of media language that's being used. This is really important, and it's something that few of you are any good at. Most of you are quite good at taking the theory and applying that to the ideas, but you're not telling me, well, how do you know this? We know this from what is denoted. The connotations come from the denotation. So talk to me about the cinematography. What is the lighting like? What is the colour like? What shot types? What camera angles? What framing? What composition? The blocking? The proxemics? Right? All of these things I want to be mentioning. Mise en scène, acting style, facial expression, props, costumes, blocking, locations. Is it indoors? Is it a set? Is it quite clearly photoshopped? Yeah, what's the weather like? All of these things. Editing. Now, of course, there's still image. We won't have editing in the same way video as I've got editing, but it's still being manipulated in post-production. Right? The photographs on the background would have been taken separately. The breath coming out of the character's mouth would have been photoshopped in. There has been editing techniques that bleach the colour out of it to make it look all blue. Right? So, alright, sound. There's no sound in a picture. Right? But if we were doing video, you could have been talking about the sound. I know we're not, but that's something you're still not doing even when you are analysing videos. Right? We also need to be talking about the conventions of poster design, the generic conventions of those, the possessory credits, the credit blocks, the taglines, the certificate telling you what certificate it is, see whether you can go and see it or not. Right? The company logos, all of those kind of things, they're all important. So, some of the general things we could have been talking about, right? Right, let's start with the horror conventions, right? What are the stereotypical horror conventions that are in this? Well, as I said, here we come into, you know, Stephen Neal and generic horror tropes, okay? Now, as I've said in previous videos, you might have seen some other videos I've posted linked to and I mentioned it in class, there are films in particular tend to be colour-coded, right? This has been particularly true since the invention of digital sort of like colour correction in post-production, right? This started, I think, with the first film that did this was Oh Brother Where Art Thou, which I think was 2000, and it's now become standard, right? So horror films and sci-fi and post-apocalyptic sci-fi and, you know, romantic comedies and, you know, all these kind of things, they tend to be colour-coded. One of the most obvious things that we see in sort of like digital colour correction in post-production is the fact that everything nowadays seems to be colour-coded teal and orange because the human the colour of human skin tends to be in the orange colour spectrum, and the sky is teal. So they make the greatest contrast because they're opposite sides of the colour wheel. So once you start realising that everything's teal and orange, you see it everywhere. Horror films, on the other hand, tend to be desaturated in their colour. They tend to be colour-coded blue or green. All the colours bleached out of it. Even when you see blood, which is, of course, have the red up, the blood itself tends to have a blue tinge to it. Quite often, you'll find. Unlike if you went back to the classic horror movies, especially the Hammer movies back in the 60s, they used Kensington Gore, which was a completely unrealistic bright red. Right? So, the colour coding is one of it, and this, of course, uses this bleached out, almost black and white colour scheme. Okay? We've also got the location. There's this forest on the background. It's winter. There's snow on the ground. There's no leaves on the trees. It's stark. It's cold. It's wintry. Here we can bring in pathetic fallacy, John Ruskin's theory, the poet, right? Pathetic fallacy is where human attributes are attributed to things that are not human. Anthropomorphization is a similar thing with this as well. We do, assign human characteristics to animals, right? But pathetic fallacy is usually applied to the weather. Not always, but just what we usually tend to think of. So this is almost death-like landscape. It's dead. There's no life to it. It's become obvious in a minute, right? Look at the complexion of the characters. Their skin is alabaster white. They look like corpses. Are they alive or are they dead? Right? Some people speculated they might be ghosts. I can see where you're coming from on that one. That is a common trope of modern horror films, especially the dead child. Another thing that's quite common in the use of film posters in particular, and horror posters, is the font. The font that's being used for the title and the taglines and the possessory credits and everything is a font called Trajan. And it is the most commonly used font in film posters. Well, it was anyway a few years ago, to the point that it became a cliche. You start to see people moving away from it now because it's such a cliche. Not only that, but the text is sort of like degraded. It looks like it's patchy. It's sort of like, it's not clean. It's got this sort of like rotting kind of feel to it. Again, very common in horror films. Right? So there are compositions we can look at here. The two characters are composed. What are their proxemics? Right? Well, they're very close together, right? It looks like they're embracing, especially when you think about the anchorage between the characters and the text, right? We'll look at that a bit later. Okay? Neither of them look particularly happy for a start. Now, there are two actors here. One of them is Chloe Grace Moretz. She plays the female character. And there's Cody Smith McPhee. He's the male character. Obviously, Chloe Grace Moretz is, a reasonably big star nowadays. When this film came out, she just really broken into the mainstream from being in Kick-Ass. So, she was the star of this film. But she doesn't get her name on the titles because she's not that famous yet. But what's she supposed to be? Well, for those of you who don't know, you could have worked this out, is that Let Me In is a vampire movie. Well, how do we know that she's a vampire? Well, yellow eyes. That's a common sort of like generic trope in horror films to show that something is monstrous. Now, whether they're zombies or they're vampires or they're werewolves or whatever, that's a common trope. But I think the dead giveaway here is her pale skin and the fact she's got blood dripping from her mouth. So whilst it doesn't have the conventional, generic tropes like the fangs, right? That is first giveaway that it's a vampire movie. Second giveaway about the vampire movie, Cody Smith McPhee's character's got breath coming out of his mouth, and Chloe Grace Moretz hasn't, even though it's cold. What does this tell us? Well, she could just be holding her breath, but it's more likely that she's dead. Which is where you could bring in the ghost thing. But with the blood on the mouth, that instantly says vampire, right? There's also the fact that traditionally in vampire lore, Vampires can only enter into a property if they're invited. Hence, let me in. Right, now, that's got a dual meaning, isn't it? It's polysemic. It's got two meanings, or multiple meanings, right? Poly, multiple, semic meaning, okay? Let me in physically, let me into your home, but also let me into your heart, emotionally. Right? Let me in as sort of a... well, sort of a romance movie, I guess. Not in a... they're both kids. So, it's not a romance movie in the same way, say, Twilight is a romance movie. But they're more like friends, I guess, right? They've got this emotional bond, this friendship, okay? And final couple of things I'd mention here. Let Me In, for those of you who don't know, is a remake. It's a remake of a foreign language film, Swedish I believe, could be wrong, called Let the Right One In, which was a massive hit, came out a few years before this. Obviously being remade for the English language. Let the Right One In is brilliant, highly recommended, well worth watching. Final thing I mentioned, although by the way that ties in with postmodernism, doesn't it? Baudrillard, it also ties in with, what Hesmagalt is talking about not taking risks and wanting franchises and remakes and reboots and stuff, right? It's a known property, as they would say. Okay, it's something that people might have heard of Let the Right One In, but they don't want to watch something's got subtitles, but they'll watch this because they know that they've heard of it. Okay, Hollywood has obviously got a long history of remaking foreign language films. The final thing is that this is a Hammer movie. Hammer, for those of you who don't remember, also made Kiss of the Vampire. They are well known for their horror movies. It's their, their unique selling point. I mean, they've made other kinds of movies in the past, but horror is what everyone knows Hammer for. They call it Hammer horror, right? And they were particularly well known for vampire movies. I mean, yes, the first film they did was Frankenstein, and they did The Wolfman and the Mummy and all that kind of stuff. But when you think Hammer, you immediately think vampires, right? You think Christopher Lee as Dracula and Peter Cushing as Van Helsing. You think of all those Dracula movies from back in the 60s and 70s. Okay? So, those are some of the things, there's nothing there I haven't mentioned in class. Right? There's everything nothing there you couldn't have picked up on. Right? Now, you're thinking, well, how am I supposed to know it's a Hammer movie if, I've not seen this before and we've not done it in class? Well, let's do a bit of textual analysis here. Look, Hammer logo. Right? That's the company credit. Tells us who made it. Okay, and it stands out pretty well. So, a little bit of close attention you could have picked up on that. Right? It's also got the icon, that's obviously the other co-production company. So, as we were talking about, what kind of things have we got here that we can talk about? Well, let's start with this font for a start, Trajan. Right? Well, why would you pick that for a vampire movie? Don't you think these look a little bit like fangs? Makes it the ideal choice. And it's kind of decaying, just like a vampire. Right? But this is a classic font, let's face it. Right? Then we've got the blood splatter behind it. Right? Again, this is telling us it's horror. I mean, you look at this picture, this is not a romantic comedy. Nothing nice is going to happen here. Right? So, as we say, we've got your two main characters. There's a binary opposite going on here. Multiple binary opposites. So you've got Claude Levi-Strauss. Male, female. Alive, dead. Young, ancient. Right? We've got the idea that, as we said, generic conventions. Steve Neal. Right? The yellow eyes. The blood around the mouth. I mean, this has been desaturated of all colour to the point that it's pretty much black and white, but they've highlighted bits of colour to make it pop. This draws your attention of the entire picture. Everything else is black and white. He's got breath coming out of his mouth. She hasn't. Now, of course, this ties in with the background, but, that's something we're supposed to pick up on. Right? The fact that the proxemics, they're very close to each other. They're embracing. Right? that tells us that there's some kind of relationship going on here, right? Neither of them look particularly happy. They're quite sad looking, right? But they're, it tells us at least they're friends, mainly not as in a romantic relationship, but there's certainly some kind of close relationship going on here. That's an enigma. That's your Roland Barthes. That's narratology. It's Svetlana Todorov. It's like, well, what's going on here? If she is a vampire, surely she, or any kind of monster, surely she's something that he should be scared of. Now, let's look at the combination between the picture and the text, the anchorage. Let me in. Like I said, is that let me in an emotional sense? Is it let me in a literal sense? Well, that tells us a vampire movie for a start, because it's one of the conventions of the vampire film, right? Down here, she will keep you safe, she will keep you close, she will keep you forever. Well, it starts off quite nice. She will keep you safe, she will keep you close. Now, if we think about representation theory, we think about, say, Stuart Hall, who says that there are, or indeed someone like Lisbeth van Zoonen, for example, we'd say that there are traditionally limited ways in which women are represented. And stereotypically, we think of the female as being the damsel in distress, requiring a man to look after her. We associate men with strength and power and agency and action, and women tend to be quite passive. This is suggesting the opposite. She will keep you safe. That itself is undermining or challenging a typical gender stereotype. She will keep you close. On the other hand, we tend to stereotype women as being more emotional. So maybe that is a bit more of a conventional female stereotype. She will keep you forever. Well, suddenly it's starting a bit creepy, isn't it? Right? Depends on where you look at it. I mean, one of the things we've got nowadays with the rise of the young adult vampire novel, like, Twilight, is the romantic idea that, being able to be a vampire and in love with someone forever is a romantic concept. So, depends on how you want to read that. So you can look at preferred negotiated oppositional readings if you want to there, Stuart Hall, couldn't you? Right? What else can we talk about here? Oh, what else we were saying with the mise-en-scène, right? He appeared to be crying there. Was it just a shadow in his eyelashes? Don't know. Anyway, the other thing here is, being a child, we tend to depict children as innocent and in need of protection. And we can think here about the representation of children in horror films. Children in horror films are either there to be threatened and in need of protection, or they then can themselves be some kind of manifestation of the uncanny or evil. In recent years, we've seen a distinct rise in the sort of like the monstrous child, whether they be ghosts or whether they be children who are possessed or in some way monsters. I suppose this kind of goes back all the way to films in the 60s like The Innocents and Children of the Damned, Village of the Damned, those two movies. And then in the 70s you have things like The Exorcist and The Omen, and nowadays we've got tons of these movies, right? The idea of the child as something threatening, that's sort of like, it's a binary opposite of the usual childhood innocence, which, let's face it, is a pretty Victorian idea. That children are innocent, but in this case it's not the innocent child. In this case the child is the monster. The child is the threat to society. Maybe this ties into Moral Panics and Folk Devils. Remember, that's Stanley Cohen. This idea that children are becoming increasingly demonised, the idea of the juvenile delinquent, the hoodie, for example, threat that was a few years ago. Possibly the idea that, a right-wing idea of this might be that children are out of control because they're not disciplined enough. Maybe it's the fear of the sort of like child being allowed to do whatever the hell they like nowadays because they won't get, the parents won't smack them or something. It might be a right-wing, response to that, I guess. You could look at that as one kind of reading. Either way, I think it's more about the subversion of the innocence, right? This ties in with Carol Clover's idea of the monstrous feminine, which I know is something I have mentioned to you, but it's not a key theory. The idea that in horror movies you get women being depicted as monsters, and that kind of reflects a fear of female sexuality, which makes, a film which you've got a child vampire problematic, right? Because it brings in all sorts of ideas that maybe it's about sexualization of children, but either way, the idea that the female as predator is something that is long been a sort of like a real, what's the word I'm looking for, a real sort of like point of horror, okay? Something that sort of like threatens patriarchal power structures, isn't it? Right? When you think about it, the idea of the child that is also a monster is another thing that threatens the typical social structure. Normally children are meant to be, not really have much of a role in society. Adults run the world. Adults are the ones that are meant to control things. And if they can't control children, then that's something that's going to be horrifying. I think that's a general fear in society in general when the young generation rise up and challenge the so-called parent culture. Anyway, what else have we got in there we can talk about? I've talked about the pathetic fallacy about the weather. Horror films are often set in the winter. It's cold, it's threatening, it gets dark early. The fear of the monster in the dark is a classic horror trope. It's rare, unless you watch a film like Midsummer, for example, it's quite rare that horror movies are set in the daylight. Very rare they're set in sunny, warm climates. They tend to be cold and dark and miserable. Yeah? What other kind of things we've got in here? Well, let's not forget the text. I've already talked about the Let Me In. Well, here we've got possessory credits. A film by Matt Reeves, the director of Cloverfield. Well, Cloverfield was a hugely successful horror film. So what they're using here again is that concept of the known property of stars. So this ties in with Hesmagulch. They're not making a big deal of the actors because if we look down here, Cody Smith-McPhee, not well known. Chloe Grace Moretz had only really been in one big movie at that point. And Elias Koteas and Richard Jenkins, they're not necessarily household names. You'll have seen them in loads of movies, and if you saw their face, you'd probably recognise them, but you might not know their names. But so they're not big enough stars to deserve an above the title credit, for example. So they're using Matt Reeves. That's a known quality. If you're a horror fan, you've probably seen Cloverfield. You probably think, yeah, that's a good film. I like that. Right? I'll go and watch that then. So you're using that as a selling point. So that's a possessory credit. It's not making any mention, interestingly, of the Let the Right One In. It's not saying based on the smash hit foreign horror or anything like that. There's no certificate on this yet because this is a teaser poster. It was a 15 certificate in this country. That's a common thing as well. You'll find that the certification of horror films is dropping, possibly as the British Board of Film Classification become more lax in what they'll accept in terms of horror and violence in films. Americans have always seen horror films as a teen genre, often getting R certificates, which mean anyone over the age of 16 can go and see it, and if you can go and see it under the age of 16 as long as you're accompanied by somebody over the age of 16. So films that would have got 18 certificates in this country get R's in America because they're a lot more lax on violence than we are. But as the BBFC's got more lax on violence, we're more accepting of it, and of horror. Horror films are dropping in their certificates. They're becoming 15s, and they're becoming more and more teen genre in this country. And again, this is a horror film about children, so maybe that's more likely to appeal to a younger audience. As we said, though, you've got your billing block down here. This is, again, a legal requirement of films. You have to be able to say who's in it and who made it. Again, Hammer Films, I think, is a major selling point here. I mean, a few years earlier, they'd had a big hit with Woman in Black. So, another classic horror film from the Hammer stable. And they're trying to bring the Hammer name back. Again, as I said, they're not making a big much fuss of the stars or anything in it. Anything else we could talk about? Again, I think the fact that it keeps repeating she might again tie into that idea of the monstrous feminine. The idea that, you know, this is a woman who is going to control you. So that's quite threatening and dangerous looking. But I also think there's other ways you could read this again. I mean, it could be seen as a, you know, a film about friendship. It's basically about a lonely little boy who's not got a father figure and hasn't got any friends, and he makes friends with this vampire who protects him from threats in life like bullies. So, you know, there's got multiple things going on here, but of course you wouldn't know that if you hadn't seen the film. So, as again, there's tons of stuff you could be talking about in this. Anything else we can think of off the top of my head? I mentioned the postmodernism, didn't I? The fact that, you know, it's a pastiche, right? So if we're looking at Jean Baudrillard and postmodernism, you know, you've got things like remakes, reboots, sequels, franchises. Well, you can see the Hammer brand as a franchise in itself, so it fits into that franchise bracket. It's a remake, and basically it's a pastiche because it's copying the original, but it's also in many ways a typical. This poster itself is so cliched. You know, it looks like every other horror film poster you'll see, right? So, you know, you look at it, you instantly know horror because it ticks all those horror movie cliches. Anyway, I could be rambling on about this for ages, but that covers the kinds of things that you could have talked about. Right? There's more than enough in there to give you a side and a half of A4 you could have written about. Right? So, anyone got any questions, you know where I am. If your answer to this question didn't hit your minimum target grade, I suggest you do it again, because if you don't, it's going to drag your grade average down. Okay? If you require any further help, obviously, if you have done this, I've sent you a detailed feedback sheet with lots, you know, tells you exactly what you need to do to make yours better, including many of the things I've already said in this. And as I said, you got this video to go on to. All right? Right, talk to you in the next one.